Hello again, welcome to another lecture. This should be quite a short and simple lecture. We're going to just discuss today noun modifiers. Okay, by noun modifiers we very often refer to adjectives or adjectival phrases, but it can also be other nouns that modify the noun, which is the head noun in the phrase. Okay. There are three different things we need to talk about. There are two distinctions that we make between different types of modifiers, and then we have a question of the order of modifiers, which will be something that you have seen before, which you discussed at school, but we'll just talk about it a little bit more. Okay, so we're going to keep this very simple. So the first distinction that we need to make is between restrictive and non-restrictive modifiers. Okay, this is very, very simple. Restrictive modifiers are modifiers which help to identify what exactly it is we're talking about. Okay? So when I say something like, not the blue jumper, the grey one, then blue and grey, right, these adjectives are working as restrictive modifiers to say which particular jumper it is that I'm talking about. Okay? Other times we use modifiers to give extra information about a particular item, particular object, but we already know which object it is we're talking about. So for example, if I talk about the hot sun, the burning sun, the fading sun, the setting sun, all of these are non-restrictive. All of these are ways of giving some information about what the sun was like at that time, but none of them are identifying the sun because there is only one sun, right? The sun refers to one object. Therefore, it doesn't need any modifier to tell us which sun it is we're talking about, at least not if we are on planet Earth, okay? So it's quite interesting, probably something that you haven't really thought about before, but adjectives have these two basic uses. One is to identify objects, and the other is to simply give extra information about objects. And we use adjectives without thinking which we're doing. It doesn't really make any difference to us while we're speaking, but in fact, it's a very, very different role, right? So in the restrictive role, adjectives are somehow determining, right? They're like determiners, they're determining which thing we're talking about, whereas they're being purely descriptive in the non-restrictive role. Okay, so either they restrict what we're talking about, which means that they tell us which thing, or they are non-restrictive. They're not telling us which thing, they're just telling us something about that thing. Okay? It's a very simple distinction, even if you haven't thought about it before. Usually people have no problem with this in the exam or in tests, being able to tell the difference between the two. We'll see when we get to the exercise. But that's really all there is to say about it. Okay, so we can move on. The second distinction I want to make is between post modifiers and pre modifiers. And if you know what the prefixes post and pre mean, then you should have no problems. Pre modifiers are modifiers which come before the noun, and post modifiers are modifiers which come after the noun. Okay, so that's very, very simple. Now, what's interesting about this is that, generally speaking in English, single word modifiers, very simple modifiers, will be pre-modifiers. Okay? Whereas phrases, okay, longer adjectival phrases, relative phrases which modify a noun, will generally be post-modifiers. Okay? There are instances where individual modifiers are used in the post-modification position. These tend to be cases where the adjective which is used is something which can be applied to the noun, but only temporarily. Okay? So there are phrases such as, you might say something like, I want to speak to the people involved. I would like to meet with anyone interested. Okay? Where modifiers like involved and interested, they mean that these people are involved or interested in this particular topic at this particular time. This is not a description of these people. Okay. So this modification is not an essential part of these people. It just describes where they are at the moment. Okay. So in those instances, we do sometimes use adjectives in single adjectives in post-modification mode, but that's not what we normally do. Post-modification, as I said, is normally about phrases, and we don't very often use phrases in pre-modification mode. Okay, this is a common mistake that Polish people make in writing. You might say something like the on the other side of the road house instead of the house on the other side of the road. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. So those kinds of phrases tend to come after the noun, not before. So one exercise that we can do just to practice this, which is a little bit of fun, is that we can take post modifiers, which generally involve more words, right, because they're usually phrases, and we can convert them into pre-modifiers. Okay, that's what we will do in the second exercise in set 8 of grammar exercises. Okay, sometimes you can simply take the words which are used and just find the simple adjective form and use that. Other times you need to be much more inventive, okay, in order to turn a post-modifying phrase into a pre-modifying word, usually. Okay, so again, it's not that you can never have a phrase in pre-modification or never have a single word as post-modification, but generally speaking, in English, pre-modifiers will be single word. When I say single word, of course, you can have more than one, right? You can talk about your big fat dog. That's okay. But the point is that big and fat are separate modifiers, which are both single word modifiers. Okay. Okay. Again, it's easier to understand these things often when we look at the exercises, but that's just the basic principle involved. The third thing I want to talk about is the order of modifiers. So when we talk about the order of modifiers, we're talking about pre-modifiers. Post-modifiers is a little different. You don't want to put too many of them, too many of these long phrases, and anyway, it doesn't really matter too much how they're put. Whereas pre-modifiers, usually single adjectives or very short phrases, do have an order. And what's interesting about this order is that nobody who is a native speaker, unless they're a grammar teacher, has any idea that this order exists. No one ever teaches this order to native speakers, and yet all native speakers stick very, very strictly to this order. And a phrase which is not in this order sounds very odd. Okay. So it's quite possible that when you were at school, you were given a list and you were told things like, first we put descriptive kind of opinion-based adjectives, and then we have something about size and something about color and something about material and origin, and then we have the noun. Okay, so you probably had a list like that. The problem with lists like that, which you get in school textbooks, is that they are never complete. Partly because it's very difficult to be complete, since there are very many possibilities of types of adjectives, types of modification, I should say, right? Types of modification. So there are a few general rules that we can apply, and then there's a bit of a slightly muddy patch in the middle, but still we can get through that. So let's just mention the general rules. First of all, there are some things which will always come at the beginning of a phrase. Okay. For example, numbers and determiners. Okay. If you think about it, so if you've got a the or an a at the beginning of a noun phrase, it's always at the beginning of a noun phrase, right? So these are also part of the modification. If you have a number, that will also come at the beginning. So, well, what happens if you have both? Well, if you have both, if you think about it, we would say something like the 3 friends that I have, right? So the determiner comes first, followed by the number. Okay, but generally speaking, these will come. Usually, you don't have both, but sometimes you do. So these will come at the beginning. Okay, not just articles, but generally determiners. They will come at the beginning. If you have a noun as a modifier, okay, so this might be forming a compound noun at the end, then the modifying noun will always be the last modifier. That's very, very important, because if you have an adjective coming in between the two nouns, okay, then it would appear that the first set of adjectives applied to the first noun and the next adjective after it applies to the second noun. So in order to avoid that situation, we have to put any noun which is being used to modify another noun, we put it right next to that noun. Okay. So remember, if we're talking about pre-modification, and we are, then all of the modifiers come before the noun, which means that the head noun, which is the one we're modifying, has to be the very last word in the phrase. Okay. So you've got that as the last word in the phrase. You can write that down right at the beginning when you're doing an exercise like the one on the sheet. You can write down that phrase as the last one, and that will always be the case. So next to it, the second to last, the penultimate word in the phrase, will be the noun, which is used as a modifier if there is one. Right at the other end, at the beginning, there'll be a number or a determiner, possibly both. Okay. So then what have we got in the middle? What we have in the middle is a series of different types of adjectives, but there is a logic to the way that they are positioned, which is that we begin with less fundamental, less integral descriptions, and we get more fundamental and more integral as we go along. Okay, so that's why we begin with adjectives which are opinion-based, which are somehow general descriptions, like words like beautiful, awful, wonderful. Okay, these come at the beginning because these are not a physical, integral description of the object. Okay, and then we move slowly. We move towards things which are more integral. Okay, so we move into things like size and shape, things like color, things like material, and things like nationality. Well, so the nationality is just part of the origin, so that doesn't have to be nationality, it can be other things. Now, in order to then remember which of these, some of you may remember from school, like a list, which of these comes first. But in order to remember which one, I think it's easier, rather than trying to remember a list, to try to just remember some particular phrases, okay, which will help you, because then you will recognize the particular items, and you'll know that that's always the way that it works. So, for example, if you take a very simple phrase like big black dog, okay, if you can remember a phrase like big black dog, that will tell you that size comes before color. Okay? You can also remember a phrase like old black dog, right, which will tell you that age comes before color. So after opinion, right, so you can say silly old man, right, so silly would be your opinion. But age would come after opinion, but before physical descriptions, because age is something which obviously affects some object over time, but is not necessarily an integral part of what that object is. Okay. Okay. You can also then, if we think of some other phrases, so you could say, I have you found a small round ball. Okay, so size comes before shape. Okay, now if you try to make slightly longer phrases in this way, it becomes a little tricky because then you just end up with a phrase that no one would ever actually say. So we'll probably we'll look more at these as we go through the examples. But obviously the material which something is made of is very fundamental. So that will usually come right at the end. Okay. Before that, generally, is the origin. Okay. So you would talk about, you might have, say, an I'm trying to think of an example which is not actually in the exercise. So let's say, okay, an English cotton shirt. Okay, so it's a cotton shirt. So cotton is the material that comes right next to shirt. English would come before that, but it would be a blue English cotton shirt. It would be a big blue cotton English. Hang on, a big blue English cotton shirt. I got that right? Yes, a big blue English cotton shirt. And of course, if it was a particular type of shirt, then it could be a big blue English cotton polo shirt, right? So the polo would be the last modifier, giving us the compound noun polo shirt. Okay. Okay. So you can try to learn a list. You can find a list in the grammar book if you want. However, I'm a little suspicious of these lists simply because they don't include everything. And then if you just learn the list and you find something that's not actually included in the list, you have a problem. So it's much better to work on the principle of fundamentality, that you get more fundamental adjectives as you go along. Okay? Remember certain phrases. And we'll look at some examples of this in the exercises. And that should be enough to help you to do the exercise. This particular exercise that you have as the last one on the sheet, where I ask you to put pre-modifiers in the right order, this is my favorite exercise. I like this exercise very much because basically what you have to do is, there's probably a mistake, in fact, on the exercises because it probably says put the pre-modifiers into the right order, and it should just say put the modifiers into the right order, right? They're not pre-modifiers yet. So what you have to do with the exercise is you find these modifiers, you make them pre-modifiers, okay? Some of them are not in pre-modification form. Some of them need to be made into pre-modifiers. Then you put them in the right order with the head noun at the end, right? That's essential, otherwise they're not pre-modifiers. Some of them you need to be quite creative, okay? But that's part of the fun. In fact, that's pretty much all the fun, right? Being creative. So, okay, that's probably everything that I need to talk about now. I will do another audio recording, I suppose, of the answers, okay? And if anybody has any questions, you can get in touch with me in the usual fashion, okay? We're getting quite near to the end now. There should be another 2 normal lectures, I think, and then we will probably try for another revision lecture, which will go out live, as we did before. Okay? All right, so for the moment, thank you.